Oh, there we go. Now, finally, some of you are saying hello. I'm like, you just let me sit here and talk to myself. But a few announcements at the top of the class. Well, a few other people will be jumping in. One, we don't have a final exam in our class. I'm going to be trying to emphasizing the fact that that the end of the semester is coming this week, in part because I want you all to be looking ahead at what needs to be done and like kind of planning the rest of your semester, because things are going to go so quickly after once we hit the Thanksgiving break. You do have a couple of papers still to write for me. So so that should be the priority class in order to finish up strong, writing these last two papers, right? But for anybody looking ahead, and if anybody, for anybody that this is their first semester at Cal State LA, final exams week is the week of December 13th. So that week you don't meet with your classes like normal. Every class just has a day and time scheduled for a final exam. But not every professor will have a final exam for you. So like, for example, what we were going to do in here is have a paper that's due before final exams. So right before final exams, other professors will have a large final paper that's due that week of final exams. And so you don't meet with them. You don't meet with the class at all. You just submit the paper and then that's the end. But some professors will have you do a sit-down exam, whether it's in person or online, where you sit down and you have, a certain amount of time to complete the exam. So that's the thing that you really want to be looking ahead now for all of your classes and figure out when that is. So we will not have a final exam. We just have these last two papers to write, and then we'll be done. The main thing. Whoops, let me make sure I'm sharing my screen properly. For us, we're in week 12, and what we're going to be focusing on is finishing the post-World War II material and the Days of Glory paper. So by now, if you took last week off and didn't watch the movie at all, then this is your time. You need to watch it as soon as possible because you're writing a paper on it. Right? This is the prompt for the paper. I know I confused some of you by also adding the prompt last week. I was hoping that some of you would get started on this paper early, but nobody submitted it. So you have this week to write this paper, right? So having watched the movie Days of Glory on Dijon, that follows the struggles of North African colonial troops. So this is key as you're writing it, is to remember that these are soldiers coming from different parts of North Africa, right? Because the North African countries that were colonies of France, right? And remember, it's estimated that somewhere around 300,000 colonial troops served during World War II. Okay, the movie is set during World War II. One of the things that the movie did was that the president at the time in 2006, Jacques Chirac, announced that he would actually be paying, that France would be paying the pensions of all of those men that served, because initially France did not pay the pensions of those troops. That was well received by a lot of people and harshly criticized by others, in large part because it hit into this debate happening all over Europe, especially in places like France and Britain, of, how do we acknowledge the contributions of colonial troops, and how are immigrants that now live in our country from these places, how do they fit into our country? Right? How do we acknowledge the legacy of colonialism in today? This is something that even the US is facing, right? This whole critical race theory debate. What it really is about how we tell the story, the history of our country, right? Via our teaching of the history. Well, those same debates are happening all over the world, and it's okay. There are really bad things that were done, right? And how do we acknowledge that? How does that fit in with our image of ourselves? And so that's what the movie hit at the heart of. So you have 2 prompts to choose from. You do not write both prompts. If you answer both of these prompts, you will not get a good grade. You really only have space in a 2 to 3 page paper to answer one of these prompts properly. So let's talk about the prompts, right? The first one is examine the way in which nationalism helps unite or divide soldiers in the film. Right? And what is the importance of the film? So a bad thesis to answer that prompt would be, the film Days of Glory shows how nationalism united and divided colonial troops during World War II. This prompt, or this thesis statement, does answer the prompt in a way here, but why would I say that this is not a good thesis statement? Someone's putting in the chat. There's no reasoning. Yes, it just restates the prompt. It's too general, right? Now, if you're going to answer this prompt, you can say that nationalism did both of these things. You can say that nationalism united and divided the troops, but you need to give a reasoning behind it, or at least where in the movie you can see it, right? So a better thesis might be something like, in the film Days of Glory. You don't have to restate the name of the movie in the thesis, especially if it's somewhere else in the introduction, but you can. In the film Days of Glory, we see how nationalism brings men from Algeria, Morocco, and other colonies fighting together under the French flag. Something like this is not perfect, okay? These examples, that whenever I give you an example of a better thesis, it's something that I'm coming up in the moment, so there's no way it's a great thesis, right? So don't think that you have to use this thesis. In fact, you cannot use this specific thesis, because this one, as mediocre as it is mine. But this one is a little bit better because, one, it talks about how these are soldiers fighting from different countries, from different colonies, right? But that they're all fighting for France, right? And in fact, I would even add something in here. This is just still a little too descriptive for me. So I would see, we see how nationalism brings men from Algeria, Morocco, and other colonies fighting together under the French flag for freedom. I would put that in there as well. Then what I can do in this paper is I would have an introduction, right? My first paragraph, if this is my thesis, I would have an introduction, and then my first body paragraph might be about the differences in the soldiers, right? And how they all come from different countries. But then my next body paragraph could be might focus on the scene where they joined. Right? There's a scene where they're all sitting around discussing why they're doing what they're doing, right? Why they are fighting in the French army. right? And then maybe a third body paragraph. Maybe it would be the scene in Paris with the women. And this is, by the way, I'm just picking scenes off the top of my head. And then I would, what you would do in these body paragraphs is if you would describe what's happening in the scene, right? And then you would analyze how this shows unity, how this shows people coming together, right? Because that's the argument. The argument is that this is about bringing people together. And then in your conclusion, you would talk about why this film is important. Right? So there I might talk about how after the war, the film tells us that a lot of these soldiers did not get the payments that they were promised, but that the film did change the political landscape, and that the president, after watching the movie, paid the soldiers, about how the movie shows that people who are not French contributed to liberating France. Right? There you can answer that question all kinds of different ways. Right? This is not the only way to do it, though. You can also make the complete opposite argument. Right? You can say that the nationalism divides. Right? How does the film divide men? Here's one idea. Racism. Right? Does the movie show the racism that some of these men experienced? Yeah. And if you focus on that, you can argue that that's the key, that the key thing to understanding the experience of these colonial troops is actually the racism they experience. Right? So one, you can talk about, how you can still talk about how they all come from different countries and the reasons they give for why they are fighting. Right? You can still use that. And then or you can also talk about each body paragraph being a different scene of racism. Right? One of the scenes is early on when they are being fed. Right? When they're being fed, and it is very clear that they are not being treated the same as the white soldiers. Right? What's another scene in which we see racism in the movie? No, now you don't remember. Aha, this is where you want to, maybe some of you need to go back and rewatch some certain parts of the movie, or if you're watching it for the first time, pay attention to that, right? There is another scene with it's one of the officers. One of the officers has a picture of his mom. Alejandra's making it even more complicated in the chat. Yes, there is, and you can use that same scene to talk about unity. Yeah, you can talk about that. See what else. Aha, yes, that is actually another even better than the scenes I was bringing up. When it comes to moving up, one of the soldiers we follow, he really wants to be an officer. He wants a military career, and is just like he's finding roadblocks every step of the way. Whereas for the white soldiers, it is much easier to move up in the ranks just because of ethnicity, race and ethnicity, right? And that shows again the racism that these troops faced. Even when they're there, they're fighting in the French army. They're still not given the same opportunities as the white soldiers. Yeah. Now, the other thing you can do is you can say both, right? If you're like, no, actually both experiences are important. It's important to see both how the soldiers are kind of united and how they're divided, but then give me the reasons, right? You see how the nationalism can both divide and unite men by looking at, and then you'd give me your reasoning, right? By looking at the racism they experienced and the reasons they give for fighting, for example, right? You want to give me something there, but that is completely up to you, right? You can make all of these arguments. You can argue that nationalism unites, that it divides, or that it does both, right? The other prompt, though, you should go back and look at the other prompt because we don't want to spend all the time in just one. Examine the boundaries that were transgressed as depicted in the film. What do these behaviors, which occurred in real life, tell us about the importance of World War II? So what behaviors did you see in the movie of people breaking rules that before World War II, they would have not been acceptable? But what were some of those transgressive behaviors? One of the things we see them, oh, someone maybe put it in the chat. Oh, yes, the African men having relationships with white women. That is an important boundary that is being transgressed, right? What I mean by the word transgressed is a rule that's being broken, right? That was a taboo. It was something that was not acceptable for these African men to have relationships with white women. So your first body paragraph can be all about that, about interracial relationships and how they were against the law in the colonies, right? They were against the law. But in the movie, like in real life, we see that actually, because they're in the middle of a war, that's not just allowed, but it was happening. And not just sexual relationships, they were like genuinely, people fell in love, right? People fell in love. But what happens in the movie to the soldier that tries to have a relationship with a white girl? Is he able to write letters to her? Does he receive letters from her? Is everything okay with that relationship? In the chat. Yeah, they're censoring all the letters from the soldiers and all the letters that they receive, and you see that they are actually not delivering his letters to her. So there was this moment of this is acceptable when they're physically together, and yet that the racism in the censoring of letters is still there. But there is this moment, right? Yeah, the soldiers are even surprised. You see them in the movie when like the French girls are all over them and celebrating them, and wanting to be with them. Yeah, that would be an important part, one element that's being transgressed. Right. The other thing that is also very obviously being transgressed, though, is that they're fighting, the fact that they're being asked to kill other white men. Remember, that was a taboo. Having men who are not white, who are not considered white, even though some of them have lighter skin, men who are not being considered white, fighting under the French flag against a white enemy. Right here, the enemy is Germany, the Germans. That was still a big deal in World War II. It had already been done, right? Been done in World War I, and now it's being done again in World War II. But it was still this big moment of, wait a minute, this is offering something that would have in fact been illegal and punished. If it happened in Algeria, it would not, it would never even be allowed. Right? But here, because of this moment of crisis in which the Allies need these men, then it becomes possible, and it opens up all these doors of what the world can look like after the war. Right? So a key thing with those, I don't care what your argument is, as long as you have an argument, your paper should not just be a summary of the movie. I have watched the movie. I have watched the movie several times. So while you can describe a scene and you can summarize some of what happens, the majority of your paper is your thoughts on that, why that scene matters, why the plot is important, what is happening that is important in the film, right? That's what most of your paper should be. So you should summarize some of what's happening, describe scenes, but more of your voice. I want more of this. What's important? Why do you need to spend time telling me what happened, right? That's your voice. That's the analysis, explaining why it's important. The other thing is citing, right? You should not need to do any research to answer any of these prompts. Right? I don't want you to do research. I want your paper to be based just on the movie and what we discussed in class. So what you are citing then is the movie. You're citing the plot. Whenever you describe a scene or you describe what happened in the movie, you cite that. Even if it's in your own words, even if it's not a direct quote from the movie, when you are describing what happened in the movie, you have to cite it. However, I am giving you the citation for it. In the prompt, if you scroll down to citing the film, this is what your footnote should look like. This you can copy and paste directly. Like, you don't need to give a timestamp. You don't need to do any of that. You just are citing the movie. Right? You don't, again, no timestamp. If you want to give me a timestamp, I'll take it, but you don't have to include it in there. That's just the way you cite movies, is just by citing the movie as a whole. Questions? What questions do you have? I know you're going to have questions now. No, then tell me, what did you think of the movie? Those of you, most of you watched it, so what did you think of the movie overall? Was it an okay movie? Was it interesting? Was it the most boring war movie you've ever seen? Are you all going to pretend you're Zoom pros?
I think it was very interesting because I think because of the lecture, the point of view was different about the movie. So, I mean, the way I watched it, it was completely different from what I was expecting. Like if I had watched it before, it wouldn't be the same that I watched it now.
Yeah. How do you think you would have watched it before?
Just the regular war movie that like people fight for. I mean, my question was, I mean, this is what I would have thought. Why would these people that have been abused for so many years, being under France, would go to a war? What was the reason? But now that I see, it was very different.
Yeah. No, it's true. And it actually, one of the interesting things to me about the movie is that it uses the structure, like the cliches of war movies, they're all there, right? They're all there. It does follow the formula of the war movie very much so. So you could just watch the movie and just enjoy it as a war movie. And it would probably work. But then there's this element of, wait a minute, these men come from places where they're not free, right? Yeah, and yet they're there fighting for the colonizer, right? Fighting in the colonizer's army, and that is like historically, just that is really interesting to examine why those men did that, what benefits do they think they were going to get, and then the racism that they experienced. Yeah. Leslie in the chat says it was a good movie, but I feel like it left us in a cliffhanger, especially about the relationship between the African soldier and the French woman. Yeah, and that was done on purpose, probably. The reality for a lot of those relationships is that they wouldn't have been continued after the war, right? In part because like the women are less likely to want to leave and follow the men to where they're from, right? When those relationships continued, it was usually because the men moved to France. Oh, and the dying, yeah. Spoiler alert, didn't watch, but yeah, Saeed dying next to the colonel, yeah. Yeah, and even amongst themselves, right? How they have different attitudes towards France. There's some similarities, but some carry a lot more of that anger of that relationship of France in the colonies, right? Whereas others like either choose to ignore it or for the moment are setting it aside. I don't know, maybe in order to do what they're doing, maybe you can only serve in the French army if you like, you know, if you set it aside. Yeah. One of the key things to me of why it's so important that these men fight in the war is because they're absorbing a lot of the propaganda that the Allies are selling them, right? This idea of we're fighting for freedom, right? Everyone always thinks they're on the right side of a war. But in this one, for the Allies, it was very clear that they were fighting an evil enemy, right? When the enemy was Nazi Germany, especially once all the stuff comes out about what is going on with the Holocaust and the death camps and all of that. But even before then, the soldiers are being fed a lot of propaganda about the reasons why they're fighting. This happens in every military. You have to give soldiers a reason to fight. And the reason they're being given here is that they're fighting for freedom, to liberate France from the Nazi occupation. And when you come from a colony, you can't help but make the connection of, wait a minute, I'm fighting for a freedom that I don't have in my country. So most colonies will get their freedom, will achieve independence after World War II, in large part because of the dynamics of World War II, in which the Allies presented everything in such black and white terms that it was almost impossible to then for people to go back home and then accept colonization like it was no big deal. Like, how could you accept colonization when you just fought for freedom? It didn't make any sense. So, and this was actually something that the US supported. not because, out of the kindness of our hearts, but for very selfish reasons. The US wanted the Europeans to let go of their colonies. Let me get into that then, which is the topic for today, decolonization. To talk about decolonization, I'm going to quickly give an overview of ending the war, because we do kind of have to end the war first, and I haven't really ended it before. So we have to end the war on two fronts, right? In Europe and in the Pacific. The war has to end both sides. The war in Europe ends first, right? Victory in Europe happens first. The big question for the Allies was how to end the war in Europe. They know that they have to advance towards Germany, right? They need to advance towards Germany, and it has to happen from multiple sides, because we're talking about a German occupation that was large. So a lot of it is it's an argument between the Americans and the British about where the best strategic way to make an advance towards Germany is, right? FDR wanted to use England as the base point, from England jumping into the continent and then pushing the Germans back. But the British wanted a peripheral invasion. They wanted to use North Africa, and from North Africa push into Italy and up into Germany, right? So they actually decide to do both things, right? The Americans and the British basically cannot come into agreement, and the North African campaign begins. The Allies land in Morocco, in Algeria, Tunisia, Libya. So Allied troops land all over North Africa. From North Africa, they make the push then into Italy and then up Italy, right? So this actually means that you have a theater of war in North Africa, where there's open fighting in North Africa, because although this is not completely Nazi occupied, the Germans did have military presence in North Africa. Those get pushed out. In Italy, it's hard fighting. The advances there are slow at first, but the Allies do advance through Italy. Italy was also under a fascist dictatorship under Mussolini. Mussolini ends up committing suicide when the Allies come in, and then it's the Germans in charge of Italy. But the Allies are making their advancements, right? We know that this is going to end well for the Allies. In the meantime, the Allies also prepare for an invasion of France, right? France is occupied by the Germans. And so the plan is to land Allied troops in France and then liberate France and move into Germany. So this is what we normally call the Normandy invasion. It was largely American troops. There were also Canadian and British troops in the Normandy landings. But let me show you a map. The Normandy landings, the British and the Canadian troops actually end up having an easier time. It's the Americans that land in kind of the hardest parts of France and end up having a harder time fighting, in part because Hitler had expected that invasion. Right? It's one that made sense that the Allies would land in France and then make their way up. So what's waiting for the Americans in the beaches in which they land is what was called the Hitler's Atlantic Wall, right? So it's filled with ramps, mines, all kinds of things that can kill, and then also soldiers on the beaches. Right? So for the Americans, it's really hard. And the American strategy was to basically overwhelm the beaches with men. Right? They don't have any other way of like dealing with the Atlantic Wall other than manpower. They had manpower. And so the idea was we will land in there and soldiers will die. There's this mass casualties in Normandy were expected. And that is what happened, right? This was some of the very famous photographs from Robert Capa, who was embedded with the Americans and took pictures of the Normandy landings. So a lot of Americans die on French soil. In the meantime, part of the plan was also to distract the Germans, because another way to attack was to use England, land in France and maybe Belgium, and then from there make their way into Germany. So the English or the Allies plan out this whole deception where they pretend that they're moving troops into the southern England portion. And so they trick the Germans into thinking that there was going to be an invasion from the north, an invasion that never materialized. Has anybody been to Normandy in France? No? Who has seen Saving Private Ryan though? Okay, I was gonna say, wait, nobody's seen Saving Private Ryan. Saving Private Ryan has what even veterans of the Normandy landings talked about, how realistic the depiction is. The very first minutes of Saving Private Ryan show the Normandy landings, and it's a very vivid description of what those landings would have been like. Yeah, I've been to Normandy. When I studied abroad in France, they took us to that guy, Tom Hanks, exactly. But then you see also a lot of actors that end up becoming very famous were in that movie. But they took us to Normandy. This is a picture of Omaha Beach in 2006, and it's a calm beach, right? But you go and if you know what happened, which most people do, it's you can imagine just the beach filled with dead bodies. You can still see the craters of the bombs, because before the Allies land, they do heavy bombardment of Normandy, and the craters are still there, left over from the bombing of Normandy. And you can see it. There's also an American cemetery there, because what was most efficient was to bury the dead there, and the French government gave a chunk of land to the U.S. so that they could bury the dead there. And when I was there, I made sure to look around and looking for the men that had served from California, and there were a lot, right? And a lot of them had Latino sounding names, right? This was the picture I took of Alberto Garcia Rodriguez's grave in Normandy. Right? And it tells you he was from California and that he died July 16, 1944. In terms of American history, it's also a reminder of how different racial and ethnic groups have contributed and have been a key part of American history. Even if we're only going to tell the glorious version, or the limited glorious version of American history, it is still Black history. It is still Latino history. It is still Asian American history. These men served and died on foreign soil. Then after the Normandy landings, the fighting was difficult, but the Allies make it to Paris and they liberate Paris. Paris was actually not a strategically or a direct line. It wasn't obvious that Paris was going to be liberated, but Eisenhower, who was commander of the Allied troops, makes it a point. He insists that Paris had to be liberated. In part for the same reason that Hitler goes to Paris after the occupation, right? Symbolically, because Paris is such a big and a city that everybody knows about and a city that people pay attention to. Symbolically, and in terms of morale, global morale, it was important for the Allies to liberate Paris, which they did on August 26th. There's a lot here, military history, that I'm obviously skipping, because going from beach and farm fighting to then urban fighting is very different. One of the symbolically important things the Allies did, though, was the first Allied troops that set foot in Paris were French troops. Right? And that was symbolically important for the French to feel like France was being liberated by French soldiers, even though the majority were American soldiers, right? But it was that important symbolic moment. That was only the Western front of Europe, though. Then without the Soviet Union, you could not win the war in Europe. You just could not. The Soviets needed to make the advancements, and they're coordinating with the British and the Americans so that they're making their advances in Eastern Europe as the Normandy landings are happening and as the invasion of North Africa is happening. And fortunately for the Allies, they're both successful, right? All the fronts are being successful. They're inching their way towards Germany. As the Allies begin inching their way towards Germany, though, they're finding the death camps. And for the soldiers that end up liberating the death camps, this was such an important moment because most of them did not expect this. They did not know that the Holocaust was happening. And to see it, they all express such a huge shock at the horrors that they're seeing in the death camps. But both sides are doing it, right? And actually the military that liberates the most death camps is the Soviet Union, right? The Soviet Union and the Americans are the ones liberating the death camps. And this is important in terms of what is happening immediately after the end of the war, because the Soviets are liberators. They are freeing the death camps. They are freeing Eastern Europe from the Nazi occupation, right? That is important for how they will be treated in Europe, right? In the first survey that was done at the end of the war about, why we won this war, who played the biggest role, most people said that the Allies won the war because of the Soviet Union and the Soviet army. Now, most of us would probably say the Americans, but we're also very biased. And of course, the Cold War is already underway at the end of the war because the Allies are in a race with the Soviet Union about who controls what part of Europe, right? And that's very evident in what happens to Germany, where Germany will be occupied by all of the Allied troops. Even France gets given a little chunk. But that becomes very clear, though, that the Allies are unified against the Soviet Union, and they want to limit the power and the control that the Soviet Union has here. Then we have to end the war in the Pacific, right? And the US is largely, it's in control of the war in the Pacific. Once it focuses on Japan, the US is making advancements towards Japan, and it's liberating all the occupied regions in Southeast Asia and China. And yet Japan was not surrendering, right? It was not surrendering. By mid-1943, it was very clear, especially after the capture of the Philippines, which was one of the hardest areas for the US, that the US was going to win. The Allies were going to win this war. Japan is just losing battle after battle, territory after territory. Even once the fighting is happening in Japan, it is very clear the US is going to win, and yet the Japanese were not conceding. They were not accepting defeat. That is the reasoning given by the US for the use of the atomic bomb. They're saying the Japanese were going to fight to the death, and that you needed something dramatic, big, to force their hand and then to surrender. Right? This was the first and the only use of the atomic bomb in world history, and it was the US that does it, right? By bombing on August 6, 1945, Hiroshima, and then 3 days later, the city of Nagasaki. There were Japanese soldiers that end up actually seeing both bombings. They had been stationed in Hiroshima first, and then they end up in Nagasaki when the second bomb is dropped. And that does force the Japanese hand. And it also changes the dynamics and the way we talk about the war in the Pacific, right? Because it is very clear here that Japan has been the victim of the atomic bomb. right? And the US, right, because this has been total destruction of Japan, is going to use Japan as a model of the free market in American capitalism, because they're going to focus on rebuilding Japan according to a capitalist model. And so Japan will become an American kind of economic jewel, an example to show the world of what can be done with American capitalism. But that all of that it hinges on the use of the atomic bomb by the Americans. Right? So obviously there's a lot of ethical and issues here that we don't have time to get into, but it's worth at least noting that, you know, this was the only use of the atomic bomb, and it was the Americans. It was the Americans that used them. Of course, the US will shift attention for the rest of the Cold War into trying to prevent other countries from attaining the technology and becoming communist. But I said, one of the most important kind of results of the world or of the Second World War is decolonization, right? Soldiers coming back to the colonies and restarting independence movements, right? I'm trying to decide in the moment whether I have time to talk about Korean War. I'm going to skip the Korean War momentarily, but India gets its independence, gains its independence in 1947. Indonesia, it gains its independence in 1949. Vietnam is going to present a complex story I'm going to come back to, because Vietnam achieves its independence from France in 1954. But that will not be the end of conflict in Vietnam. Morocco gets its independence in 56, Tunisia, Algeria, Mozambique, anyway, so on and so forth. This is the decade of, you know, the end of the 40s and the 50s is a bunch of countries getting their independence, some more easily than others, right? Some countries, the European country that colonized them, just kind of lets it go. And then in other places, the Europeans will take a stand and say, no, this country cannot get its independence. That's going to be the case of places like Algeria. All right, so some places, right, like Vietnam, for example, was no longer economically beneficial for the French. Right? It's too much of a mess. They're losing money. They're not making money off of Vietnam. And that was part of why Vietnam is kind of allowed to have its independence. Now, there's also an independence movement. There are people fighting for independence, and that plays a big role of, you know, how the French assess what they're going to do here. But there is this kind of letting go of some of these countries by the Europeans. Vietnam in particular, if you look at their Declaration of Independence, you're going to notice a lot of similarities. Right? This is from the Declaration of Independence of the Republic of Vietnam, September 2nd, 1945. The first line is, all men are created equal. They are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Where have they taken those couple of lines from?
The Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, the American Declaration of Independence, right? It is right there. Those are the same lines that are in the American side. Why? Why would they take those lines unedited and put them in their own Declaration of Independence? Why not change it up?
To show that they're kind of like the same, or they're allied.
Yeah. I'm like, one, the American Declaration of Independence, it was a famous document that even globally people recognized. And in part, even though the colonizing country here was not the US, it's using American language, maybe in part too, to have American support, right? Saying, hey, actually, we're doing the same thing you did. This is not a new concept. This is not a new idea of people have a right to rule themselves. This is something that you will recognize, and it would, and it did appeal to a lot of Americans. Like, wait, that is exactly what we did. So why should we not support the Vietnamese here? Right. So, and they would. The American public did support a lot of these independence movements. Right. This is also, though, it's the same language that's in the French Revolution documents. Right. In the rights, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, the wording is all men are born free and with equal rights and must always remain free and have equal rights. Right. It's the same idea. It's using the words of the colonizer to achieve independence. Right? When they wrote those words, the French and the Americans, then they were not necessarily thinking of the rest of the world. Right? They were certainly not thinking of the Vietnamese, but the Vietnamese could use those same words to fight for their own independence. Right? And that was the power of those ideas. The ones with the growth of those ideas and the spread of them, it really makes it creates a trajectory that can be taken by other parts of the world. But I said, some colonies, some places, the Europeans just had a really hard time letting go. One of the most visible examples was Algeria. Algeria, at this point, was the crown jewel of the French Empire. It was the colony that was making the most money for the French and the one that was considered the most important colony for the French. So while they were okay with other colonies getting their independence, they drew the line at Algeria and said, no, Algeria cannot have its independence. Right? The occupation of Algeria had begun in the 1830s. So here we're talking about over a century of occupation of Algeria. There had already been independence movements before, not very successful, but they grow in popularity and they grow in power after World War II in Algeria. The independence movement in Algeria was the Algerian National Liberation Front, or the FLN. Those are the initials that you'll most likely see it as, the Front de Libération Nationale, right? And its military version of it was the National Liberation Army. So there's both this kind of political liberation organization and a liberation army in Algeria. And a liberation army was necessary in Algeria because the French sent their military to maintain Algeria as a colony, to put down any kind of insurrection, right? Now, why? Why would the French just refuse to give Algeria its independence? Even as the independence movement grows and becomes more and more successful, the French still they refuse to give up Algeria. What do you why other than the financial elements, why else do you think the French would just be so intent on keeping Algeria a colony? Any idea? So this is true not just of Algeria, but of the other European, not just of France, but the other European powers. And that is the psychological effect of losing their empires, of losing all of their colonies. Remember that in the in the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, the Europeans had really built their identity around being colonial empires, right? Their sense of self, their sense of who we are depended on having that other, on having control of groups of people all over the world. So as they begin losing their colonies, they're also having to figure out who they are without colonies. They're having this like existential crisis. And like poo woo for them, they need to figure it out, right? And stop harming the rest of the world. But they really have a hard time. France has such a hard time with Algeria because they view, one, Algeria is so financially important to the French, but also they've been giving up so many other colonies that they felt like, wait, we're about to lose all of our colonies. How can we be French without colonies, without an empire? And so they go to extremes to maintain Algeria a French colony, right? The Algerian War was notorious for the use of torture and the kind of extreme and atypical way it was fought. It wasn't even like World War I and World War II had already been a shock to the way the military runs wars, but it was even more so in Algeria. In Algeria, this was basically guerrilla warfare, right? One, because the French had a superior military. The French military was superior to the Algerian National Liberation Army. Facts. So how can an inferior military force defeat a much superior military? The best way is really guerrilla tactics, right? And that was what the National Liberation Army did. They, in 1955, they were even willing to massacre civilians in order to harm the French military. The first kind of recorded massacre of civilians by the National Liberation Army was in the town of Philippeville, where 123 civilians were killed, including women and children. For the National Liberation Army, this was a strategy because they needed to eliminate anything that could aid the French army, right? So if there were Algerian civilians helping the French military, the idea was then they're helping the enemy. So it was, you're either with us or you're against us. It doesn't matter if you're Algerian, if you're helping them, then you are fair game to target. It wasn't just the National Liberation Army, though, that was using these kinds of tactics. The French army used torture during this war. In a lot of ways, it kind of was a precursor to what the US does during the War on Terror, because it used the very same kinds of arguments that the Americans later used, right? The French argued that the Algerian War was not a traditional war, that you a lot of times couldn't tell who the enemy was, because the National Liberation Army would sometimes use children or women to explode bombs near military targets. So if you couldn't even know who the enemy was, you needed information. And the best way to get that information, the French argued, was to torture people with information. And what really stands out with the use of torture during the Algerian War is that a lot of the individuals that made up the French army that used torture had actually been tortured themselves. A lot of those French soldiers were World War II veterans who had experienced horrors during World War II. And then were able to do that in Algeria. At first, the French military denied that they were using torture, but it became really obvious even during the war that they were doing it. There was a lot of evidence of it. And after the war, the French, I mean, people came out and admitted what they did. People who participated in the torture came out and told their stories. They admitted that they had participated in it. Right. So we have actually interviews of French soldiers in which they give the reasons. They explain why they did what they did. This is from one of those interviews in which a French soldier said, "We do not refer to the Algerians as human beings. We call them rats or bugnols. And it's easy to torture a bugnol because you figure he's not a human being." This is the same thing really all over the world when you see kind of extreme tactics. It's a dehumanization of quote unquote the enemy, right? In order to be able to do something that extreme to another human being, you have to not think of them as human. And so that's what a lot of the French soldiers that tortured Algerians describe. Another one, he actually says that he was a World War II veteran, and he says, if one day there's another Nuremberg trial, we'll all be convicted. Every day there was another Orateur, and this time we were committing them. The reference here to Orateur was a village in France that was burned down by the Nazis, by the SS. They took all these civilians, all the people living in this village, locked them in the church, and they set fire to the church. Right? It was just a horrific massacre in this village. And what the French soldiers are describing is they knew, right? They knew that what they were doing was equivalent to what the Nazis had done. I mean, they're saying it was the same horror that the Nazis did in France. We are doing it here in Algeria. So this ends up becoming emblematic of a new kind of warfare, right? A warfare that is more guerrilla warfare, right? And that is even more extreme than some of what we saw during the world wars, right? Because this was supposed to be outlawed, right? After the end of World War II, the UN is created, and there's a Declaration of Human Rights. The international community says that even in the middle of a war, you cannot torture your enemy. You cannot. That's in the laws of the UN, in the charter of the UN. Now, initially, when the Declaration of Human Rights is first written, it is accepted by most of the allied countries. The US signed the Declaration of Human Rights. Guess which country did not sign the Declaration of Human Rights right away? The French. It was actually, the Declaration of Human Rights was partially written by a French diplomat, and also Eleanor Roosevelt was very influential in the Declaration of Human Rights. So it was partially written by a French man, and yet the French did not sign the Declaration of Human Rights in the 50s. Given what I just said, why do you think the French wouldn't sign this declaration and agree to those rules? in the chat. Yeah, they knew. They were publicly denying that they were using torture in the Algerian war, but they also knew that they were doing it and that they could be prosecuted in international courts for violating human rights and using torture. So they just didn't sign it. They just didn't sign it. Now, there is this story is even more complicated because the National Liberation Army also used torture. They also tortured members of the French army, and so it ends up being a huge mess. This is a huge mess, kind of the equivalent of the Vietnam War to the U.S., right? But what one of the keys that we're seeing here is this search for identity, right? Search for identity by the colony. The colonies want to form their own identity. They want to be politically, economically, culturally independent. And then from the Europeans, also trying to figure out who they are, right? What does it mean to be French without colonies? What does it mean to be British without India, right? Those questions of who we are and where do we fit into the world then are complicated by new immigration patterns after World War II. What ends up happening is a lot of movement all over the world, people migrating, especially from former colonies to places like Western Europe. Right? There's a increase in North African immigrants moving to France. And that will only increase for the rest of the 20th century and into today. And that then kind of complicates this question of who are we? What does it mean to be French, to be European, to be all these things? But also, what does it mean to be Algerian? What does it mean to be Moroccan when you have migrated to Europe? And in that sense, those stories of immigration are very similar to the immigration that had already been happening in the US and will also continue, right? Of who are we in a country in which there are large numbers of immigrants? How can we define what it means to be American? We will get to the US now, because after World War II, the US becomes the global power along with the Soviet Union, right? It's the US and the Soviet Union fighting for global power. And so then we have to talk about, here we go, the 60s and the 70s and how the US influence plays out all over the world, but we can do that on Wednesday. We can do that on Wednesday while you all work on your Days of Glory papers. So I will stop recording here. And does anybody have any questions?